Financial leadership is changing. CFOs no longer record history. They make history. This podcast will help you become a better leader, strategic thinker, and digital visionary. Welcome to Secrets of Rockstar CFOs, the ultimate podcast for chief financial officers. Follow along as Jack McCullough engages in exciting chats with accomplished CFOs, learning how they overcame obstacles and positioned their companies for the future. Here's your host, Jack McCullough.
Welcome back, everyone. And I am really excited by our guest today. This is one I've been looking forward to because the title of this podcast is Secrets of Rockstar CFOs, and Dallas Clement is a true rockstar CFO, and in fact, I might even go so far as to say a bit of a unicorn. Dallas is the CFO of Cox Enterprises, and why he's a unicorn is that he's been part of Cox since 1990. And we're living in a time where average CFO tenure is supposedly under 4 years. So that's a remarkable tenure. Dallas, welcome to the Secrets of Rockstar CFOs.
Jack, you set a high bar. Thanks so much for having me.
No, it's great to have you. And I think Cox is probably, close to a household name. If you're not, I'm not sure who would be, but for the benefit of the 7 people who might not be familiar with the company, can you give like a little overview on the company?
Sure. The company's been around 127 years, started as a newspaper company, the 5th largest newspaper in Dayton, Ohio, back when there were lots of newspapers in every market, and has evolved over time into other media, radio, television, cable, got into automotive services with Mannheim and Auto Trader. And today we're the largest owner operator of next gen greenhouses. We own Axios. We own a government software business called OpenGov. So today we're about $23 billion in revenue with a variety of businesses, and family's still very much engaged. Alex Taylor, my boss, is a 4th generation of the family, and family has high hopes to be around for another 127 years.
Yeah, that's great that the family's still engaged. And I don't know if you remember this, but it came out in the, I'm going to say the 90s. But there was a woman, and she didn't have any particular obvious expertise, but she was like a Warren Buffett level stock picker. She just did phenomenal. She consistently outplayed the market, and she never told what she was doing, but finally towards the end of her life, she did. And her investments were just in companies that were named after the founding family. Like so Ford, Dow, DuPont, Cox. And
Right.
she just said, look, if the family's still involved, it's more than a business. And that's where she wants to put her money. And it really worked out well for her. So,
Well, the governor in his will, he said effectively, do right by your employees, do right by your customers, do right by the communities that you serve, and the family will be fine. And, I think if you're looking to do something for the long term, you have to be able to deliver on behalf of all of your stakeholders. You can't suboptimize any particular stakeholder over the long term. And that's what I think the family and Cox has done so well over these last 100 plus years.
no, that's fantastic. So, and definitely want to explore Cox, but I'd love to understand a little about your background. So where did you grow up, Dallas?
Sarasota, Florida.
Oh, nice. And so what was that like living in Florida? So you and I are about the same age. So growing up we had great music and great movies and other things. I had lousy weather in New England.
Yeah, no, Sarasota had nice weather. I lived right on the water. It was wonderful. It was a small community. Most everyone lived in ranches, and most of my friends lived on the water, and never went away to summer camp because I essentially lived at summer camp, and I had a good group of friends, and we could see each other via the water or bicycling. Before I could drive, rode my bicycle everywhere. Harder to do now, especially in a big city. I'm in Atlanta right now. But in a small town like that, you could do that, and it was a wonderful, wonderful area to grow up in.
Fantastic. And so what was your first job as a kid?
My first job as a kid was stringing tennis rackets. I got paid $3 for every racket that I strung, and I could do typically 2 in an hour, so it was about $6 per hour. And I think the minimum wage at the time was maybe, I don't know, $2.50 an hour. So I was doing pretty well. I wasn't working 40 hours a week, but for the time I was working, I was doing pretty well. But that was my first job, stringing tennis rackets.
Yeah, it's funny. I know there are people, some teenagers and 20 somethings who listen to the podcast. $6 an hour. What a solid salary that is. But I remember $2.95 to work.
Yep.
Around that same period of time. And I was damn pleased with my paycheck. So
Absolutely. Absolutely.
a little
Absolutely.
bit of a different world. So you graduated and you went to Harvard, and then you actually got a master's degree from Stanford too. Do you know what we called Harvard and Stanford in my high school?
No, what do you call that?
Safety schools.
There
So
you go.
you studied Harvard and you got a degree in economics. I'm kind of curious, what was sort of the thinking with that? Obviously, I think it was economics and maybe mathematics, but obviously you must have been highly mathematically inclined.
Well, I did do well in math and science in high school. And, back then, we didn't talk a lot about college and you certainly didn't visit colleges. You sent a note card away to get the application and you looked at the thickness of the application. And that was your first filter as to decide which college to apply to. And there were colleges, I think Dartmouth had a really big application. And I said, yeah, that's too thick. I'm not going to do that. So I applied and got accepted and very fortunate. I'm quite positive I couldn't get accepted today. But when I went, I thought that college was all about getting more or less a vocational degree, sort of thinking about your job. And since I was good in math and science, I thought engineering. And so I started off as a mechanical engineer. And over time, I sort of realized that I was going to one of the best liberal arts schools in the world, and college was less about vocational degree, more about critical thinking, and you could do critical thinking in any number of disciplines. And I should probably take advantage of what Harvard had to offer. And because of all the math prerequisites I had taken for mechanical engineering, applied math and economics was as close to liberal arts as I could get, given that I was 2 years in with a lot of math prerequisites. But it allowed me more electives in my junior and senior year. So that was how I navigated my degree at Harvard.
Yeah, and it's interesting because today there are a lot more options to becoming a CFO.
Yep.
But it wasn't very common that people with an economics background would be on a path that would eventually, lead to being a chief financial officer. But I think there are a few skills for CFO, particularly one with a company as global as Cox, more valuable than being able to understand economics. And do you find what you learned back then is helped shape your career as a CFO?
Well, it's interesting. During my 35 years here, I sort of developed a point of view that, depending on the organization, depending on the individual, depending on the board, depending on the CEO, there's sort of two flavors of CFO, right? There's the more traditional flavor where you grew up, you got an accounting degree, CPA, you went and worked for one of the big accounting firms for a while, and then you entered a company in financial reporting or audit or something like that, and then made your way up the ranks in sort of more traditional sort of finance. There's others that are sort of problem solving, and there's any number of disciplines you could do in college, and you could go do consulting, you might do investment banking, that kind of thing, and that creates a path into CFO, and it creates a profile of a CFO that can manage a controller who has a CPA and does T accounts, but whose skills might be sort of critical thinking, problem solving, advising, strategy, etc. And I sort of learned that for me, I'm more attuned and I like more the strategy, the critical thinking, the partner to the CEO. I'm less attuned to the T accounts and the accounting, the financial reporting. I can manage the folks and I understand the drivers, but that's not the differentiation and the added value that I bring to the table.
Interesting, a reference to T accounts. I didn't anticipate that coming up in this conversation. So, but no, you're right. Like I'm the former, kind of the more
Uh-huh.
traditional background. I worked at what's now KPMG for a few years, and accounting manager, controller, CFO. And I got my first CFO job, and my background, other than the dates and could change the name of the companies, but it's almost like the identical resume to a bunch of other people that got their first CFO job
Hmm.
at the same time.
Yeah, yeah.
Today, it's really different. I see engineers and economists and all sorts of people not just getting the job, but flourishing in it. So.
Well, and it depends, it's a critical partnership with the CEO and the organization and sort of a catalyst for the organization. And, different CEOs need different kinds of CFOs and different companies need different kinds of CFOs. So, It's a wonderful role for a variety of personalities and skills.
Right, indeed. So one thing I want to ask you a bit on the personal nature, but I'm aware you're dyslexic, and I know that presents some challenges both academically and probably in your professional life. So, great admiration that you've come so far with it. But, what have you learned from having this, and how you sort of developed this phenomenal career while overcoming dyslexia?
Well, I think, what's interesting is you can choose when you have a difficulty, you can choose to harp on that difficulty, or you can figure out coping mechanisms that create strengths in other areas based on the reality of the difficulty. And those strengths create your authenticity, how you approach what you do. And so for me, as an example, in mechanical engineering in school, it became obvious that it just took me longer to get things. And therefore, I rarely did better than C's on midterms. But in order to get it, I had to think about it from a variety of angles. And in the process of thinking about it from a variety of angles, by the time I got to the final, I typically always did really well in the final. And in applied math or mechanical engineering, if you do well in the final, you can't argue you don't know the material. And so what it taught me is to trust the process. It taught me to think about things from a variety of angles, outside of the box sort of thinking, and not to panic. And I think a lot of those are valuable skills for a CFO to have, especially in markets like today with a lot of uncertainty. And when you're on a path and you're not sure where it's going to end, and so sometimes you have to trust the process until you create more clarity by virtue of the process on where it's going to end. But you have to, as a leader in an organization, CFO or otherwise, you have to create that calm, and you have to show it, that calm for the rest of the leaders in the organization and the rest of the troops. And so I think those kinds of things help me became sort of, quote, my superpower, if you will, my strengths in how I approach problem solving, how I approach, difficult issues, volatility, et cetera.
Well, I think that's just absolutely fantastic that you can turn something that, some people would have considered, really problematic, and you've made it into a superpower. So good for you, and that's wonderful. But one of the things, you've worked so long at Cox, and we'll get into it a little in a moment. But what it's known for, amongst other things, is a very strong culture, maybe a learning culture, and a committed leadership team. So undoubtedly, in your 30-something years there, you've probably had some wonderful mentors along the way. And I'm wondering if there's any that you look back that stick out that, really made an impact on the type of leader you've become today.
Sure. It's interesting. I'll talk about the mentor, but what I will say is when I think about the strong culture, and I've started to say this more and more, what Cox has is a very consistent sort of set of values. And I talked a little bit about it from the governor's will, do the right thing by your employees, your customers, the communities that you serve. And the way I think about culture is where the leader and the life stage of the business you're in meet the values. So as an example, Cox Communications, our cable business, when I was there, the president of the cable business was a gentleman by the name of Jim Robbins. And Cox Communications at the time had a particular culture. It was heavy growth, very dynamic. We moved from analog video into digital video, high-speed internet, digital telephone, started getting into wireless, et cetera. As compared to today, the cable business is more mature. Mark Greatrex is the leader today. Both Mark Greatrex and Jim Robbins exude the values of Cox. That's why they're leaders. But the culture in those two organizations, Cox Communications of the 1990s versus Cox Communications now, is a little bit different. And it's because Mark Greatrex is a different leader than Jim Robbins. And the life stage of the business is a little different. And so you have to operate at a different pace back then versus now. And so, that's point one relative to culture, your question. And then relative to mentor, I also I've had a variety of bosses, and I've had a variety of people work for me, and a variety of boundary partners. And what I would say is that I think I've taken a little bit from everyone and learned from everyone. And to your point, Cox is a learning organization. I try to learn from everyone. Where I was most a sponge for learning was earlier in my career when Jim Robbins was the leader. And so if you asked me to pick an individual who had a broader impact, it would be Jim Robbins as a mentor back in the early part of my career. But I wouldn't still be at Cox if I didn't feel like I was still learning and still being challenged and still picking up something from every single person I interact with. So I view the whole community as a mentorship to me.
Oh, that's a beautiful thing. And one of the things that I came across and prepping for this is convos at Cox, and a learning community. Tell us a little about that, and I'm
Sure.
assuming you're deeply involved in it, and why it's important.
Yeah, so we do not have a back to the office mandate. Back before COVID happened, we instituted a policy of unlimited PTO, but that meant that our leaders had to lead and our leaders had to hold their respective teams accountable. And now, as on the back end of COVID, we don't have a return to the office mandate because we've asked our leaders again to lead, because not every group has the same requirement to be in the office as every other group. People do different things. And oh, by the way, during COVID, for example, in our Mannheim locations, we had drivers having to go into the auctions and drive cars every day or recondition cars. You can't do that job remotely like you can an accountant or sort of whatnot. So we didn't have any mandate then. We don't have a mandate now, but we ask our leaders to lead. But in terms of the overall environment, we're trying to remind folks that it's hard to build relationships. It's hard to build culture. It's hard to get to know folks remotely. It's much better to be in person. So we try to create engaging activities on campus that draw people in, create opportunities to get together. And so Combos at Cox was a brainchild of our comms team and marketing team and out of our HR organization that said, hey, let's get leaders to sit down in our cafe, have a session, and talk about whatever they are passionate about. Could be one of our women leaders talking about work-life balance. Could be someone else who has struggled with some kind of difficulty. Whatever it is, whatever you're passionate about. And for me, I'm passionate about the early career folks, and I've got 4 daughters, and we may talk about them in a bit, but I love to be there and help and learn from these kids who are in college and very supportive of the intern program. And I told one of our leaders of the intern program, I said, I'd love to visit with the interns and learn from them and sort of speak to them. And they said, hey, would you want to do a Convos at Cox focused on the early career folks? I said, sure, but be happy to do that. What I didn't know is that they like to create a title for those, and the person said, well, what do you want to call it? And I thought for half a second, and I said, oh, how about early career advice from an old guy? And he looked at me thinking that I was joking, not really sure. And then he laughed. He said, I love it. Let's do it. So that was what we were going to do. And then someone else, I was on vacation a week or two later, someone else sent me an email and said, hey, Dallas, I've been thinking about the title. I think we're going to tweak it to I want to know what you think about tweaking it to been there, done that, early career advice from Dallas Clement. And I read that out loud to my daughters, and predictably they went, ah. And I said, I'll tell you what, let's move it back to early career advice from an old guy for a couple of reasons. One is making fun of myself is part of my authenticity, and I want to exude that. And that's an important message to these early career folks. A. B, the reality is I am an old guy, and I should not in any way represent that I know where they are, what they're doing, the challenges, and what's different then versus now. So I should create an opportunity and permission for them to take what resonates for them and throw away the stuff that doesn't resonate. And so I think it just does it better by saying, early career advice from an old guy. And so we kept it there. And I just finished in July, my third. I've done it for 3 years in a row. And it's fun. It's great. I love it. They ask great questions. They're really engaged. They're much better prepared at their stage of their career than I was when I was their age. And it's fun.
That's funny. My notes actually have advice from an old guy in quotes. I
Mm-hmm.
just thought somebody was paraphrasing. It didn't occur to me until now that was the
No,
actual.
that's the title. That's the title. And and I appreciate people wanting to protect me in some way, shape, or form. I said, no, you don't need to protect me. I am the old guy. I own it.
Yeah.
It's all good.
And I just want to say a more thin-skinned guy than me might be upset that you call yourself old, considering I'm 2 years older than you. So, or at least I graduated 2 years
Well,
ahead of you.
you
So
know, I feel it every day, and my daughters remind me of it every day, and so you just got to own it.
cool. Well, that's great. Well, you sort of answer the question in advance, but we'll expand a little bit on it. Because again, by reputation, Cox has one of the best finance teams in the game. So I'd love it if you could share sort of your philosophy on building a high performance team and, in particular, attracting those early career professionals because, let's face it, they have a lot of options right now as they enter the workforce, a lot more than maybe we did.
Sure. Gosh, back when we entered the workforce, really, you could go get your master's. You could go into accounting. You could go to investment banking. You could go into consulting. There were no startups that back then, and so you're exactly right. I guess what I would say around sort of building a high performing organization is people coming in. I talk about the what and the how of work, and so people always talk about the purpose and the why, and that is incredibly important, and I agree with that. However, for some people, they need something more tangible, more right now than why or purpose or long term. And the what and the what and the how are you were hired to do something, do what you're hired to do. And the how is how do you show up? How do you engage with your boundary partners? How do you ask questions? How do you support other people in the organization? And what I tell folks is the bare minimum is the what, do what you're hired to do. But the way you differentiate and the way people give you permission to, and really embrace you to take on new roles, new challenges, is how you engage, how you ask questions, how you show up. How consistent are you on doing what you say you're going to do? And do not underestimate the value of that. And if people do that within an organization like Cox, then some people get caught up. For example, a finance leader gets caught up by staying in the lane of, quote, really hardcore traditional finance. Someone that started with a CPA, does internal audit, then they go to financial reporting, then they're in FP&A, then they're in biz ops or something, and they don't ever get out. And at least in an environment like Cox, you could go from Cox Communications to Cox Automotive. You could go into the treasury group. You might go into the finance group. You might go into the strategy group, the corp dev group. And at least at a company like Cox, we want the broad, experienced CFO. And we're going to err on a CFO that hasn't done the career ladder to get where they are. They've done the career jungle gym. They've done a variety of things because it means they've built different skills, different neurons have connected, different challenges, not just finance challenges, more strategic challenges. And we think that makes a CFO candidate better prepared to be that advisor to the CEO, that partner to the CEO, and help to navigate new challenges. Because what we're finding in the real world is that new challenges every day, things that you could not have prepared for. There wasn't a class that said, how do you prepare for COVID? And there wasn't a class that said, how do you prepare for AI? And so, we want people to build their portfolio of skills in a variety of ways so that they're more dynamic and they can problem solve in any situation.
No, that makes a lot of sense. It actually, you're doing a fine job of anticipating my questions, but I was actually going to ask you, and you sort of led to it, but, connect the dots a little bit because you've been there, decades and, now senior role, finance, and you've had a lot of different roles in there, but, automotive, connect that to broadband and, connect it to recycling and to technology. And it's a pretty diverse group of companies that are part of Cox Enterprises.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So when I came in 1990, I reported to the CFO of the cable division, and the cable division at the time was just analog video. But we also happened to be the third largest franchisee of Blockbuster, if you remember the Blockbuster stores.
I do.
And I was sort of a kind of a chief of staff analyst. We were in the midst of re-regulation. And I was just helping the CFO on whatever came up that was out of the ordinary that he needed help on. And I helped on budgeting for the Blockbuster stores. I helped understand the regulations and figure out how we could price set-top boxes for the marketing group, a variety of things. McKinsey came in to do a big study on Cox Enterprises around advertising, technology, regulation, and I was the liaison to the McKinsey group out of the cable group. We went public in 1995 via a reverse Morris Trust structure, and we didn't have anyone that did investor relations. But by that time, I had built a reputation for understanding the business, asking good questions, communicating, understanding the finances, understanding the culture. And so we could have hired someone from the outside who knew investor relations, but didn't know the management team, or take someone internally who knew the management team, could work with the management team and teach them investor relations. And leadership decided the latter. And so I became the investor relations person, and sort of led us, had 26 different sell side analysts covering us, and I engaged with them. And to this day, I have several who I still talk to sort of strategically about what's going on in the marketplace. And then in 2000, after we had sort of launched these home run platforms, digital video, digital voice, high speed internet, I moved over and became a direct report to the CEO, Jim Robbins, to run strategy and product management. And for the next 10 years, I shepherded what we were doing in product and also sort of launched our effort in strategy. At the same time, and this is, I'll go away for the 10 years around Cox Enterprises. At the same time, our media businesses were starting to be dislocated. Newspaper was starting to sort of fall off. Cable was now the biggest business. We had launched Autotrader.com, and it was seeing heavy growth. We kept it separate from Manheim because they were at different stages of life cycle. So Cox Enterprises had a Manheim business, largest wholesale auction company in the world, Autotrader, and that was in automotive. And then we had these media businesses, radio, television, and newspaper, but newspaper was starting to decline. There was uncertainty in radio and television, but they weren't declining yet. But we pulled all those together into one media group. So by the time we got to the late teens, we had a media group, we had Autotrader and Manheim, and then we had Cox Communications. In 2004, Cox Communications, 2004, 2005, we did the largest take private at that time of any large company, spent $8 billion in Cox Enterprises, leveraging the Cox Communications balance sheet, spent $8 billion to buy back the public shares of Cox Communications and take it 100% private. So we get to the 2013 or so, and we merged Autotrader and Manheim to create Cox Automotive. And so we finished the teens with media, cable, and automotive. And media was starting to see real dislocation, and we made the hard decision to sell our television and radio stations. That closed in 2019. And so as we entered into the 20s, it was cable and automotive, and we were developing and delivering free cash flow, and the family wanted to continue to operate businesses. And so we had to decide, okay, well, what? We could invest in anything. Well, back to what the governor said, wanting to do right by our communities that we serve, our employees and our customers. If I hone in on communities, Alex Taylor, Jim Kennedy, both family members, are huge outdoorsmen. And so Jim Kennedy back in 2007 started Cox Conserves, and Cox Conserves was all about making our operations more sustainable. And we had big goals in zero waste, zero water, and zero carbon footprint. In fact, we were the first multidisciplined company to reach zero waste across all of our businesses. We hit that designation back in 2024. So really excited by that. Alex Taylor, my current boss, fourth generation of the family, about 6 years ago said, hey, can we punch above our weight? And can we start to look for businesses that do good by the environment, clean tech? And we went and evaluated strategically the clean tech environment and sort of prioritized those areas that we're seeing more change, those areas that didn't already have an obvious winner, that we could start to invest and build businesses or acquire businesses over time. And we've happened on a couple of different ones, but in the controlled environment agriculture, next gen greenhouses, we started with an investment in a company called Bright Farms, which is doing leafy greens. We then looked at a company that does vine crops called Mucci Farms. Today we own both. That's part of Cox Farms, and we've done some follow-on acquisitions. And so we now have next gen greenhouses that grow tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, strawberries, and all kinds of leafy greens. More sustainable water, uses 80% less water. Depending on the source of energy, is green, less waste, fresher produce. So we think it's a win-win and much more resilient in an environment where you have floods, you have drought, etc. So we're excited by that. We're in a business called Nexus Circular, which is using pyrolysis to recycle hard to recycle plastics back down into sort of the base oil that goes into crackers to create plastic, to create new plastics. So it's ultimately circular. And then we looked at other areas where we could get involved and do something and align with our purpose and leaving the world a better place. And we have a strong passion for media, but the media in the form of newspapers is a struggle with the advent of the internet. And we really loved what Jim Vandehey and his founders were doing with Axios, and had an opportunity to make a small investment. And then they liked the partnership we brought to the table, and now we're the majority owner of that. The founders are still very much involved. So we love that. We did the same thing in government software, a company called OpenGov, which is essentially helping local governments take the technology, the ERP, the platforms off-prem, move to the cloud. And OpenGov has a wonderful sort of partnering platform to help those cities and municipalities manage more efficiently. And so we're sort of building out this diversification over time, bringing on new leaders, new blood. Back to my comment before, these leaders of these other companies have very much aligned values as to Cox. But you know what? They're at a different stage of life cycle. They have different personalities. So the culture of their business is a little bit different, and that's okay.
Yeah, no, what a fantastic company. So that's some
It's a lot of fun. I'm very fortunate to be at one company for 35 years, but a variety of industries, a variety of roles.
Indeed, because like I other than when I worked at KPMG, I don't know that I've ever worked for a company that has as many as 200 employees. It's trade-offs and it's good and bad.
Mm-hmm.
But so as a small company guy at heart, I find that just absolutely fascinating. What a complex and diverse set of businesses you have under the Cox Enterprises roof. So
it's fun. It's not without challenges, but it's every business and every situation has that mix.
yeah, that's fantastic. So anyway, I'm not sure if you've heard of this little thing called generative AI, but I have a
I heard about it
feeling.
somewhere.
Yeah, that was one of those things. One day I hadn't heard of it at all, and the next day it was like the dominant thing in my life. But I'm kind of required to ask you about generative AI to keep my license as a podcaster. But how is Cox using Gen AI? Within the finance organization and maybe beyond as well.
It's interesting. You said Gen AI, and oftentimes people will say, "What about AI?" And to which I always say, I view Gen AI not necessarily as a step function, but as a continuation in quote AI. And if you think about AI, and people forget, well, in order for AI to be effective, you have to have your data house in order. And if you have your data house in order, that means you have strong protocols relative to privacy. That means you have strong cyber protocols. And we've been on a journey in all of our businesses around that. And if you have your data and if over time you're going through processes, there's this little thing called robotic process automation that now no one ever talks about because it's all Gen AI, but it's automation. And robotic process, automation is automation. And before Gen AI, there were new iterations of intelligent automation. And Gen AI is one set of tools. It's different than machine learning and sort of analytics. And that's a different set of automation. And Gen AI is a particular kind of automation, but it still needs to have your data house in order, and you need to have your protocols for privacy, protecting data, et cetera. And so what I love about Cox, speaking specifically about Gen AI, is that we have leaders in automotive, we have leaders at Axios, we have leaders at OpenGov, we have leaders at Cox Enterprises who have different use cases and reasons to use Gen AI or any kind of automation. And they have permission and are leading how to engage it in the way that is relevant for the businesses they serve and for the problems they're trying to solve. So the way Cox Automotive uses it may be a little different than the way OpenGov is using it, and that's okay. If you were to abstract up, well, and then you're say, okay, give me some examples. Well, so even before Gen AI came, we were already using the Azure and AWS clouds. And because Azure is more OpenAI oriented and AWS is more Anthropic oriented, we're getting exposure to both of those. And because Axios has engagement in their AI newsletter, they're talking to the leaders of all these AI companies. And they're also recognizing that even with digital journalism, there is still disruption that is happening for that business, and they have to be more efficient. And so Jim Vandehey and the founders of Axios are saying, hey, everyone has to embrace AI in every role to be more efficient, to be more effective. And so they are very much leaning in. And so what we do at Cox Enterprises is we say, let's bring all those leaders who are engaging together so that we can share best practices, how people are doing it. How are you doing code development? How have you evolved what you're doing in Agile using Gen AI? How are you thinking about development environments versus production environments in a new world of Gen AI? And how can we move faster? And for those that are in customer care, maybe we're not ready quite yet to use Gen AI to engage face to face with a customer, but we can certainly use it to read through the recordings or listen through the recordings at the end of the day, come up with summary reports, what worked, what didn't work, etc. We can certainly use it and or machine learning to create real-time remediation plans if a customer has a problem and in terms of they want to call and disconnect and what's a relevant package for them to try to keep them to be a customer. So we're using it for all those. We're using it for creative. In our automotive group, we have direct marketing on behalf of dealers that we develop. And so we're using it to create that direct marketing scripts for our dealers to be able to use with their customers. So we're using it all over, and I'm excited by our decentralized way that we use it and think about it and engage it in a way that is relevant for the businesses that are part of the Cox family.
No, that's fantastic, and you're right. I mean, Gen AI was probably a little bit too specific, but
it's okay. It's okay.
So top of mind. So yeah, I want to change gears because there's two questions that I get to ask a lot. One of them is about AI and advanced technologies generally, and the other is, and I get asked this a lot by first-time CFOs. And it's like, how do you build a relationship with the CEO? And, there's a lot of talk about, sure, one does report to the other, but it's a strategic partnership. And what's interesting, in recent years, CFOs have said this for, a decade, probably longer. Lately, CEOs are saying it too, that yes, my most important strategic partner in my business life is my CFO. So, Alex Taylor, who I think you previously mentioned, he's descendant of the founding family, and he's been in the role 7 years. But how do you build that sort of trusting, strategic relationship with the CEO so he doesn't think of you as just the numbers guy?
Yeah, I think of credibility. I think of reliability. I do what I say I'm going to do. But then so that's the easy one. Do what you say you're going to do. But the credibility, what I would say around the credibility is over time, he has to believe I'm not going to tell him what he wants to hear. I'm going to come up with my own point of view based on facts on what I think is the right thing to do. And it's not meant to challenge him. It's meant to be on behalf of the company and what's in the best interest of the company. And he might still want to do what he wants to do. In which case I'm going to jump on board with that because he is the CEO. And or if I have to have built that credibility such that he knows this isn't an agenda for Dallas. This is Dallas's only agenda is what's on the back, what Dallas thinks based on what he knows, and the analysis he and his team have done is in the best interest of Cox. And over time he builds that confidence, that trust, and and I think more and more examples of that helps to build that relationship over time.
That sounds
That
good.
plus, I think the other thing is how do I show up? The how. How do I show up in terms of how I support other leaders in the organization? How do I show up in supporting my team? How do I show up in supporting him? Because I do think the CFO, like any other leader, that how is important, especially as you get to be a more senior leader in an organization, because you are an ambassador on behalf of the company, and he wants good ambassadors, people who show up, who, if other people see, will think highly of Cox.
That's great. So I want to ask you a little bit about the underrated aspect for CFOs, work-life balance.
Okay.
Because I've been a CFO, not at a company anywhere near at the complexity level as Cox, but it's a stressful job. It's not the type of job you can go home and leave it at the door. But, I'm looking at a list of five philanthropic activities that you do. Woods Hole Oceanographic in my home state of Massachusetts, Junior Achievement, and a few others. And you also mentioned the fact that you've got four daughters as well. Plus, being a CFO of this huge company, if anyone knows how to do it, it's probably you. What's your advice for achieving that elusive work-life balance?
Well, you've clearly just explained to everyone that I don't do any of those very well, but save that. I guess A, you do the best you can. B, you do need outlets, and part of my outlet is love to travel with my family, and I do take the time to travel with the family. Part of my outlet is exercise. I'm a huge rackets person. I play squash. I play this new game that you may have heard of called Padel. And I have my buddies that I do that. And when I'm playing those games, it's my own version of my own mindfulness. I can't stress about anything because I'm in the heat of the moment. And so I know that whether it's travel with the family or the exercise, that allows me to sleep better. And if I'm sleeping better, I'm eating better. And if I'm sleeping and eating better, then I'm thinking better and I show up better for work. I also show up better for the family, and it's a virtuous circle. And that's what I have found over time works for me.
If I may ask, how old are your girls? Just they're young enough that you can still
Sure,
take vacation.
23 to 29.
Okay, so that's a great age. So good for you. And
They're a
I'm not
great
gonna
age,
ask-
but I forgot when I was in my 20s how much angst there is in deciding sort of where you want to live, who you want to be with, what you want to be.
yeah, yeah. So it's but no matter how old y'all get, they're always going to be your girls, right?
That is
So,
true.
but,
That is
I,
true.
I'm not
Lucky to
going
have
to
them.
ask. I'm not going to ask you to prove it because it would be inappropriate. But do you know they're all four of their birthdays?
I do.
That is really impressive. So anyway, I just a couple of questions that I'd like to ask of you, and to wrap things up. The first one is, how do you see the CFO role evolving? It went from, you mentioned back in the day, a lot of us were accountants. I got my first CFO job because I was a damn good controller, but the job has changed and it's continuing to change. When you look into your crystal ball, what do you see?
Well, you know what? It's hard to get away from the numbers, and what I think the numbers do, and what I think it's hard to get away from the numbers, and sometimes people get lost in the numbers and they don't know what the numbers say. And so I think the CFO of the future has to understand the numbers well enough to know what they say, what they don't say. That means you're linear enough and you're global enough to be able to provide insights to the right audience. And those skills, call it critical thinking, communicating, are really important, not just about the numbers, but also about the company's strategy, about solving difficult problems, disruption from Gen AI, et cetera. And so I think the numbers piece is a wonderful learning ground, but take those skills of understanding the details and understanding the implications of the details and use that to help your boundary partners, to help your CEO, to help your organization. And I think more and more organizations will be looking for the CEO to bring those kinds of skills to bear.
That's great. And, this whole conversation has been, advice for the next generation of CFOs. It's practically a masterclass. But I do often like to close with that question, what is some advice that you'd like to pass on to, the future CFOs, the people who are going to achieve that role in the next year or two? And a lot of it you've already said, but maybe the most two or three.
I think the piece that maybe I didn't sort of say specifically, I alluded to it a little bit, the what and the how, but more specifically, when you have the CFO title, and you ask questions in a meeting, people tend to have a perspective that you're going to slash their budget or you don't trust them. And so as a CFO, you have to figure out the right body language, the right how to be able to ask the questions without people being threatened by it, because you need to be the one that understands how the business, how the operation, how the department works. And what I have found is that you have to figure out that break the ice sort of situation so you can ask the questions, because once you ask the questions and once people are comfortable with you asking the questions, I just think there's better thinking, better problem solving, people have better trust, but you got to get past that first sort of distrust because you have CFO on your title. And so, and people can learn that skill from the earliest age, how to ask a question without it appear threatening, dismissive, et cetera. It's particularly onus when you have the CFO title.
That's interesting. No one's given that answer before, so that's great. But so Dallas, you get a lot going on. I mean, with 37 boards that you're on, and four daughters, and just your job. So I really do want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today. And I would just like to give you the final word.
Well, Jack, I just want to thank you for the opportunity and thank you for what you're doing to help the CFO community. And it's important to have these kinds of conversations that are balanced in this crazy world. And I appreciate the hard work that all of your CFO viewers and listeners are navigating in. And I wish everyone the best of luck in the coming years.
Thank you for listening to this episode. To continue your exploration of this role that focuses on strategy, leadership, finance, and technology, listen to more episodes of the show at rockstarcfos.com. Join this revolution, episode by episode. Push yourself to achieve great things and unlock the best opportunities available to you. CFOs are creating a legacy, and it's time for you to leave your own unique imprint on the world today. That's all for now. See you on the next one.